Hans, my good and dear friend, I hear you're suffering from what we in Germany call the beer flu. Is that right?
That's absolutely correct. I'm sorry, this will not happen again.
I guess I must clarify for our viewers, if a German does not maintain a steady intake of 0.5 beers per hour, he dehydrates. If this distressing state is being prolonged over 2 or 3 days, he unavoidably starts to speak High German and watch this week's episode of Star Trek Picard twice.
So please bear with me while I hydrate my mangled body.
And I carry on the torch of the German perspective on this week's episode of Star Trek Picard Hide and Seek. Enjoy, guys.
And now, the concierge of greatness. This is the Sci-Fi News Video Review with your hosts, Daniel and Jens.
Well, guys, thank you again for joining us for this week's episode of the German perspective on Star Trek Picard. We're talking about Hide and Seek, the penultimate episode for this season of Star Trek Picard. And Hans, my good friend over here, he's going to take it off from the top, and here we go.
Thank you, my friend Franz, and I'd like to start my conclusion today by analyzing a short dialogue from this episode, a dialogue that is typical for so many things that I despise about New Trek. The reason why so much anger has built up in me in the last weeks when I think about Star Trek Picard. It's about one of the scenes between Raffi and Seven of Nine, in which Seven explains why she did not join Starfleet after the arrival of Voyager at home, because she wears Borg implants and she has been refused of an admission to Starfleet. What kind of stories do they want to tell us here, and more importantly, what kind of messages do they want to send? The Starfleet of the past, which accepted a Klingon with Worf, a Ferengi with Nog, suddenly stops with a human being with cybernetic implants? A fictional vision of humanity that has freed itself from social constraints and cultural differences, that has evolved intellectually, that has even influenced many real biographies, including my own. It must no longer exist, or even worse, it should never have existed. Seven of Nine was not accepted into Starfleet because of xenophobia, really? I understand the message of those responsible, the perfidy of tearing down everything that once made Star Trek great. We have already talked about the dismantling of the character Picard in one of the last episodes, but what fucking motive do the assholes have for doing this? What narrative are you trying to establish? Is this to discredit the utopia of a 20th century white man, or is it simply due to the lack of talent of the authors? My conclusion: the precision which such dialogues are written, in which certain images are created, no longer allow the presumption of a coincidence. And while I can only speculate on the true motive, with each episode my anger increased at the disrespect with which the authors dismantle such a great franchise as Star Trek. The Borg stood for a lot of things, and everyone had his own interpretations of one's greatest threat to the Federation. For many it was the absurdity, technical perfection, which in the end leads to the facts what makes society, namely individuality, free spirit, and imperfection must be replaced by the perfect symbiosis between technology and nature. Some also saw in the Borg, the image of overdrawn communism, a totalitarian regime in which every free thought must submit to the will of the collective. In 2022, the Borgs are ex-mercenaries armed with machine guns, whose queen lets herself be convinced by the assimilation of one individual that is possible to assimilate other civilizations peacefully and with respect. Again, I ask myself why they tear down great ideas with full intention to be able to give some random action product the title Star Trek. I could express my anger about almost every scene in this episode. For example, about the stupid alliance between Dr. Soong and the Borg. Brent Spiner in his probably most unworthy role he ever had to play. I could also philosophize about the lame resolution of Picard's childhood trauma and the helpless attempt of the authors to somehow squeeze that into canon and literally beg for legitimacy. We also have Elnor, now a holographic emergency program that carries all the memories of a Romulan Starfleet cadet, including the memories of how he felt about Raffi at the moment of death. Finally, I could complain about the partly lousy technical realization of many scenes, which at times seem more like a low-budget production than an episode of Star Trek. Yeah, but I don't want to do that because just the plain description of these things make me feel bad again. So, I rate this episode 0 out of 5 points. Franz, bitte übernehmen Sie.
0 points.
0 points.
From Germany.
From Germany.
Shocking. Shocking. Shock and awe. Like the Iraqi defense minister always said on his height. Well, I will dive a little bit into the story of this week's episode, and while the transporters are still down, Picard chooses to Romulan beam to the chateau instead of the ship. And I have to question his tactics here. If the goal is to defend the ship, why not go there in the first place? And why are Seven and Raffi not using the fancy Samsung tricorders if they are in desperate need for information about the enemy forces? Well, why don't they use that slick EMP generator they had when they freed Rios? Wouldn't that be nice against some Borg? But I guess the writers want you simply to forget what happened the weeks before and watch the shiny explosion and green laser pointers of sorts. The scenes in the past with James Callis are well performed by him, but suffer from the same lack of impact they suffered from before in the previous episode. The entire story arc simply does not make much sense here. Why is his brother absent? Why is Jean-Luc's father not there during the big revelation? Letting a small child wander around the chateau, having him find a skeleton key that could release his suicidal mother. What sort of bullshit is this? Why is that skeleton key just laying around if Picard's mother's mental state is in such decay? Why is there no proper treatment or care for her? Why does she get locked in a room without any supervision? If this is supposed to be the bright future Picard always told us about, where the sick are being cared for, where mental illness is not stigmatized but cured, is this the new Star Trek, I ask you? And if this is the new Star Trek, I personally don't want to watch anymore, quite frankly. Well, speaking about watching, we have to watch Dr. Soong, and he's on the hunt. But again, why? Why is he joining the hunt himself? Why is he standing in front of a terrible lit green screen and superimposed onto a background from Microsoft Paint? Seriously, guys. How can a multi-million-dollar production get simple chroma keying shots so horribly wrong? Hans and I, we both sit in front of a homemade green screen for this show. We do this in 4K resolution, live, sometimes in German, and we get it better, or at least as good as the 10 million per episode show called Star Trek Picard. Also, muzzle flashes, they suck. They do not project proper light on the affected surfaces. This really feels like someone watched an Adobe After Effects tutorial from the late 90s. Besides the technical aspect, the hunt is still so weak a Hirogen would turn away in disgust. The prey is not really running, and when he is, he's being interrupted by terribly paced flashbacks to the past. And again, the pacing itself this week is horrible again. But let's summarize as we march towards the final episode. The crew of the La Sirena and Picard himself have failed in each and every way possible. They've beamed onto public roads, they've gotten captured by authorities, they did not drink beer, they've escaped and caused a big mess, they left evidence from the future behind, and they got Agent Mulder fired. Basically, it is the complete disregard of time travel rules and should lead to the destruction of the future time itself. Shout out to my good friend Davros, by the way. And while in certain older civilized cultures, when men failed as entirely as they have, they would have thrown themselves on their swords, but not the almighty crew of the La Sirena and Picard. They carry on, they will rewrite history, and they will rewrite the entire next generation. The story about a station all alone in the deep space, the voyage home, everything we loved and cared about within this franchise. This has to be rewritten if they follow the rules they've personally made up. No amount of explaining would ever make the presence and impact of Picard and his crew in the past across 2 continents believable. Neither to the inhabitants of Earth of 2024, nor the viewers of the show. If we start out with the premise of butterflies in regard to time travel, one has to honor the self-inflicted rule of storytelling here. Unless of course, Q reverts everything. Everything we've watched for 9 episodes, and render our compassion and emotional investment to this season irrelevant. I see no other way to retain the future in a plausible and believable way. I only see a penance for Q and not Picard, where he sacrifices himself to save the future we know. Q has stated in the previous week as episode that Picard was never supposed to get to the past. So perhaps all what has been happening was caused by Q himself in a way. And if he is dying, if he is the one who wants to repent, it would make sense in a way to have him revert everything back to normal as his final act. Perhaps the final episode next week is called the Dallas Effect, and Picard simply steps out of his shower. And while I find this to be the only plausible way to end this season, I very much doubt that the writers will go down that road. Instead, we will simply have to accept that Jurati becomes the new Borg Queen through a twist of fate, and she will stop Picard from destroying the fleet. Perhaps by planting some sort of seed within the timeline like we have seen so many times before in Voyager. I only see one positive aspect this week, besides my beloved beer. This isn't beer. He's still sick in his mind. I only see one positive aspect this week, the attempt to change something so evil like the Borg into a force for good. While it still seems like an idea from an untalented fanfiction writer, in some way or form, I cannot acknowledge the notion that no one ever, no matter how lost, no matter how tormented and evil, is beyond repair. While this aspect only gets a few minutes of screen time, it is by far the best development in the entire season. Yet it is still on the level of an idea and has not been thought through and isn't believable at this point. It's a nice idea though. Hide and Seek is the name of a game children play, and it is on that insubstantial level that the series performs. As of now, I don't think that they can salvage this mess of woven storylines, but perhaps the worst is yet to come. There are simply too many plots, too many story arcs and aspects that need a resolution to bring this mess of a story to a logical and satisfying end in the final episode. But please, please prove me wrong here. If you out there were looking for answers like I had, answers about Q, the story itself, or even basic time travel storylines, you'd be disappointed immensely this week again. This is not science, this is not fiction, there are no stars, there is no track towards them. When I look up, I only see a shattering 0.5 out of 5 points from the German perspective for this week's episode of Star Trek Picard. Well, Hans, how about some Flammenwerfer? Hans gets a Flammenwerfer. Feels much better. Feels much better.
So, my dear friend Franz, there is no hope for the season finale next week.
I don't think so. I don't think so at all. No, it's too woven. It's too complex. It's beyond repair, I think.
Yeah. And it's too dumb.
Yeah. Have you been entertained a little bit at least this week, apart from the obvious Star Trek flaws? No, you haven't?
No, not a second. Really, not a second.
Mm. Okay.
There's so much anger when I think about Star Trek Picard in the last 3, 4, or 5 episodes. There's no entertainment for me in this product anymore.
Hopeless.
The
true German way.
The true German way is hopeless. Okay.
Perhaps it is. Well, we've got good beer. You don't. So cheers, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the German perspective. We will be back next week with the final episode, the 10th episode of Star Trek Picard next week. Please join us for the German perspective. Until then, cheers.
Cheers.